Next, we'll move on to the focus on valid arguments. What is a valid argument and what are we supposed to focus on? The traditional logic focuses heavily on determining whether an argument is valid. Whether an argument is valid, a valid argument is one. Now they are giving the answer about the valid argument. So, what is a valid argument? It is one where if the starting statements, now we also got the definition of statements. Statements are premises. If the starting statements are true, then the conclusion must also be true. So, traditionally, logic would focus, the definition of logic focuses on whether an argument is valid. And a valid argument is one where if the starting statements, that is the premises, are true, then the conclusion must also be true. It's like following a set of rules that ensure that if you start with the right ingredients, you will get the right result. So this is the focus on valid argument. Traditionally, logic would focus only on valid arguments. Now this valid arguments is defined as if the statements or the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. This is what a valid argument means in traditional logic. If the statements are true, that is, if the premises are true, then the conclusions must also be true. Let's move on to deductive reasoning. What is deductive reasoning? Traditional logic is rooted in deductive reasoning. Now we'll have to understand what is deductive reasoning later on. This is the process of taking general rules and applying them to specific situations. So in deductive reasoning, we take general rules and then apply to specific situations in deductive reasoning, from general rules to specific situations. For example, if we know that all humans means it is a general rule, all humans need oxygen to live, and then specific like Sophie is specific, all humans is general. So Sophie is a human, so we can deduce means come to a conclusion that Sophie needs oxygen to live. So basically in deductive reasoning, we deduce or we come to a conclusion from general rules to specific situations. That is, we take general rules and apply them to specific situations. This is the important definition of deductive reasoning, where we take a general rule, that is all humans need oxygen, it's a general rule, and apply that to a specific situation like Sophie is a human, and then come to and deduce, or we can say that therefore Sophie needs oxygen to live. This is an important definition of deductive reasoning. Once again, deductive reasoning takes a general rule and applies it to specific situation, and thereafter we deduce or come to a conclusion from that deductive reasoning. So from general to specific, deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning in traditional logic always tries to go from a broad rule, that is general rule, to a specific case, that is Sophie, from all humans to Sophie, ensuring that our conclusions are solid and therefore the conclusions are also solid and having a solid foundation. So, to recap, first we understood what is the traditional definition of logic. The traditional definition of logic states that basically the traditional definition of logic studies the principles of correct reasoning, and the logic helps us to determine if the argument is making sense and following a valid path from the start to finish. Now, this traditional logic focuses heavily on determining whether an argument is valid. And what is a valid argument? Valid argument is one where if the starting statement or premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. Next, we saw what is deductive reasoning. Traditional logic is rooted in deductive reasoning. Basically, deductive reasoning is a process of taking general rules and applying that to specific situations. And there is an example here. If all humans, if all is general, if all humans need oxygen to live, and Sophie is a human, Sophie here is specific. So Sophie is a human, then we can deduce that Sophie would also need oxygen to live. In traditional logic, deductive reasoning goes from broad rule or general rule to a specific area or to a specific case, ensuring that our conclusions are solid. Next, let's look at foundations in Aristotle's work. Traditional logic has its root in the work of ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle. He developed a system known as syllogistic syllogistic logic, syllogistic logic, where logical arguments are broken down into basic forms. So, this Greek philosopher Aristotle developed a system known as syllogistic logic, where the logical arguments are broken down into basic forms like the example about humans and oxygen. That makes it clear whether an argument is valid or not. So, whenever we are trying to put across an argument, the important point is to understand whether it is valid argument or not. Now, what is a valid argument? Valid argument, as we saw earlier, is an argument where the statements or the initial statements or premises are true and the conclusions are also true in a valid argument. So when the arguments are valid, then the statements and the conclusion both are true. This is the definition of a valid argument, where both statements that is premises, and the conclusions inferred from those statements or premises both are true, then the argument is a valid argument. And traditional logic is heavily dependent on deductive reasoning. So, traditional logic has its root in the work of Greek philosopher Aristotle. Aristotle developed a system known as syllogistic logic, where the logical arguments are broken down into its basic forms. For example, the humans and the oxygen part. Example that makes it clear whether an argument is valid or not. So we understood what is a valid argument. In a valid argument, the initial statements or the starting statements or premises are true, and the conclusion flowing out of that is also true, then it is a valid argument. So basically, traditional logic is all about analyzing arguments, then spotting valid patterns and identifying flaws in reasoning so people could communicate clearly and argue effectively. So, traditional logic is all about analyzing, spotting valid patterns, and identifying flaws in reasoning. This is all about traditional logic. Analyzing arguments, spotting valid patterns, and identifying flaws in reasoning. Now, let's move on to the modern definition of logic. So, the modern definition of logic basically it expands on the traditional ideas. So, modern definition is also based upon traditional idea, but it expands that further because it is much broader and includes many new ways of thinking about reasoning and truth. In modern times, logic isn't just about whether arguments make sense on the surface. So, the modern definition of logic is not only concerned about whether the arguments make sense or not, but it dives deeper into the structures and systems of reasoning in various fields, from math and computer science to language and philosophy. Syllogistic logic was developed by ancient Greek philosopher Aristotle, but the new definition of logic is based on symbolic logic. One of the biggest shifts in modern logic is the development of symbolic logic. In this approach, logical statements are translated into symbols and formulas similar to math. So, modern logic is not only about whether arguments make sense on the surface, but it dives deeper into the structures and the systems of reasoning in various fields, from math and computer science to language and philosophy. Now, modern logic is based upon symbolic logic. In this approach, logical statements are translated into symbols and formulas similar to math. This lets logicians, people who study logic, analyze and manipulate arguments with great precision. often using mathematical techniques. For example, if the traditional logic says all humans need oxygen to live, symbolic logic could represent this as a formula with symbols that makes it easier to combine and analyze complex statements. Broader applications. Modern logic includes not only deductive reasoning, that is, from general rules to specific situations, but also inductive and abductive reasoning. Inductive reasoning is about drawing general conclusions from specific examples. Inductive reasoning is about drawing general conclusions, whereas in the deductive reasoning, so inductive reasoning, so earlier we saw deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning was from general rule to specific situation. Here in inductive reasoning, it is general conclusion. That is, we draw a general conclusion from a specific example. It is reverse here. There it was general rule to specific situation. Here we are coming to a general conclusion from a specific example in inductive reasoning. For example, seeing that all observed swans are white and concluding that all swans are likely white. So inductive reasoning is about drawing general conclusion from a specific example. So in this case, a specific example is that we are seeing that all swans are white. So we conclude that all swans are likely white. That is, when we observed those swans, we saw that all of them were white. So we concluded that all swans are likely white. So this is the example of that. Let's look at the abductive reasoning. So let's just revise first about deductive reasoning. Goes from general rules to specific situations, whereas inductive reasoning comes to a general conclusion from a specific situation or example. There is a basic differentiation between the two of them. So abductive reasoning is a bit like making an educated guess based on the best available information. That is abductive reasoning. So in abductive reasoning, we are taking a guess, a calculated guess based on the best available information. That would be like trading in the stock market. So we have three types of reasoning: deductive reasoning, inductive reasoning, and abductive reasoning. In deductive reasoning, we come from in deductive reasoning, we follow from general rules to specific situations, whereas in inductive reasoning, we come to a general conclusion from a specific example. Whereas in abductive reasoning, we take an educated guess based on the available information.